Question 1. By cross-referencing drug information, electronic health records can provide doctors with automatic warnings about adverse drug reactions. Likewise, at a hospital in Boston, serious medical errors decreased by 55% after an electronic record system was implemented. So before you attempt any connectors question, you need to be very certain of the relationship that the connector is trying to establish. So the first line here is saying that electronic health record systems are hugely beneficial because they can cross-reference drug information from a variety of sources. And so they can give doctors automatic warnings about any drug reaction that might be harmful for the patient, right? So for example, let's say the patient is allergic to a medicine, then an electronic health record would have that information and it would let the doctor know not to prescribe that medication for the patient. So that's the premise. That's what the first sentence is telling me. The second sentence is giving an example of a hospital in Boston where serious medical errors decreased by a whopping 55% after an electronic record system was implemented. So you are using the second sentence to give an example, an impressive example of what is being described in the first sentence. Now, likewise cannot be the connector for this because likewise is used to compare two analogous situations, right? So for example, electronic health records can provide doctors with automatic warnings about adverse drug reactions. Likewise, some other kind of health record can have certain other benefits, right? So I would have two analogous situations where electronic health records and some other kind of health records are discussed. So that's not what's happening here. So A is out. Still is used to indicate a change in argument, right? Still is used to indicate that there is a pause and something else has to be spoken. For example, I was very tired, still I made it to the party. Right? So there is a contrast that I was very tired. So ideally, the expectation is that I would not go for the party. Still, yet, I made it to the party. So that doesn't fit the context here. In this case, doesn't make sense here because the first sentence is an argument for the benefit of electronic health records. So it's not a case or it's not an example by itself that I need to expand on. So it doesn't make sense. In fact is a good connector when you're introducing an example which is kind of impressive, right? So you're saying that electronic health record systems can reduce errors. And then you're saying that at a hospital in Boston, these errors reduced by 55%, which is a huge deal. So in fact, would kind of introduce that example since that example is quite impressive. So the best answer for this is in fact. Okay, question 2. Effective communication is crucial to the success of a job sharing arrangement. Nevertheless, Levine and Rocco each planned to work 3 days a week with a day of overlap on Wednesdays. They also planned to talk each evening on the phone to discuss the day's work. So again, what are the two lines saying and how can I choose a connector between them? The first line is saying that if you have a job sharing arrangement, which is to say that the same job, the same title, the same designation is shared by more than one person, then those people have to effectively communicate with each other for this arrangement to work. So effective communication is crucial for the success of any job sharing arrangement. And then the second line is kind of presenting or giving an example of how Levine and Rocco planned to effectively communicate, right? They planned to work 3 days a week and have a day of overlap so that they could discuss things on Wednesdays. They also decided to talk on the phone every day. So what they wanted to achieve with A is what they're trying to do with B, right? So B is a means to achieve what A wants. the first sentence, what it wants. The second sentence is a means to achieve that. So I can't say nevertheless, right? Because nevertheless indicates contrast, right? For example, so again, a very simple example, not the best example, but it would give you an idea. I was tired, nevertheless, I came to the party. So again, it's a sense of contrast, right? Still, I came to the party. So nevertheless would be used for more formal settings, but you get the idea. So that doesn't make sense because the two sentences are not contrasting. To this end is a good connector in this context, because what end are they trying to achieve? They're trying to ensure that they effectively communicate. So to this end, to the end of effectively communicating, Levine and Rocco made all of these plans. So I'm going to keep this for now. However is again a contrasting connector. However is used in place of but when you're trying to kind of present two opposing ideas. So that doesn't make sense. And similarly is like likewise in the previous question, where you would use it when you were talking about two similar or analogous situations, right? But this is not two similar situations. The second is an example or a way to reach the first. It's a way to achieve what the first sentence is saying. So that doesn't make sense as well. And so the best answer is option B. Question 3. New journalists claim that truthfulness in reporting is better achieved by emphasizing individuals' subjective realities. New journalist Michael Herr, for instance, argues that in scrupulously compiling facts about the Vietnam War, the mainstream media missed the truth that mattered, the experiences of individual Americans in Vietnam. So let's unpack what this argument is saying. The first line is saying that there is a category of journalists called new journalists who say that if you want to achieve truthfulness in reporting, which is to say that if you want to get to the nub of what you're saying in a journalistic piece, in a news report, you can achieve that the best by emphasizing the subjective realities of individuals. Why is this a striking claim? Because when we think of journalism, we always think about facts. We think about, absolute truths that cannot be questioned, right? We always want journalists to focus on facts. But new journalists claim something different. They say that if you want to get to the heart of a story, you need to go beyond facts and also look at what individuals went through, what was their subjective experience during an event. Right? That's what new journalists say. So that's the first sentence. And the second sentence talks about a new journalist, Michael Herr, who says that he kind of presents this idea of what new journalism is in the context of the Vietnam War. He says that the mainstream media that reported on the Vietnam War, it was scrupulous about compiling facts. It was scrupulous, meaning it was meticulous. It was extremely good. It compiled facts with high accuracy. It was scrupulous about compiling facts about the war. But in doing so, while they were scrupulous, they did not get to the truth of what mattered. What mattered, as per a new journalist, is what individual Americans went through in Vietnam. So what mattered was the subjective reality, the subjective experience of an individual American, not just the facts and figures of what happened on the ground. So if you think about it, the second sentence is presenting an example through Vietnam War of the definition of new journalism presented in the first sentence. The first sentence tells you what new journalism is, and the second sentence presents an example in the context of Vietnam War. So I like for instance, because for instance is used to say that this is an example. For instance, Michael Herr argues that in Vietnam, this is what should have been done. So I like that. By contrast is not correct because the second statement is not a contrast to the first statement. So that is definitely not correct. Above all is sort of a concluding connector, right? So, this happened, that happened, something else happened. But above all, this was what we learned, right? So there was a session on data transfer, there was a session on something else. But above all, it was a productive session where we learned something about computers, right? So it's kind of a concluding connector. And that wouldn't make sense here, because here the second sentence is not concluding the first sentence, right? So I wouldn't choose option C. And for the same reason, I wouldn't choose option D, because I'm not concluding with the second sentence. I'm presenting an example. And so the right answer is option A. Okay. Number 4, science depends on factual precision, of course, and the distinction between monoplastics and a great garbage patch in the middle of the ocean is not a trivial one. However, misleading metaphors can be more effective than strictly accurate descriptions in drawing public attention. So again, let's unpack. Most of the time in connector questions, you would have to be very certain of what the sentences are saying before you come to an answer. So I can see that the first sentence is trying to talk about monoplastics, and it is saying that the distinction between monoplastics and describing them as a great garbage patch in the middle of the ocean, that distinction is not a trivial one, is not a small one. It's an important distinction. Because science relies on precision, there is an important distinction between calling something a garbage patch and referring to it as monoplastics, right? So that is an important distinction. And the second sentence is saying misleading metaphors can be more effective in drawing public attention. So there is a contrast in between the two sentences, right? The first sentence is saying that there is an important distinction between calling something a garbage patch or calling it monoplastics, because science relies on precision. But if you want to get media attention, if you want to get public attention to focus on an issue, you need to have something that is catchy. And a misleading metaphor like a garbage patch is catchier, is more attention grabbing than something regular or something scientifically regular, such as monoplastics. So there is definitely a contrast, and I like however, right? So I'll keep however, because however works as but, so it works sense. Okay, what about in contrast? Why is in contrast wrong? Because we said there is a contrast in the sentence. In contrast would introduce an opposite idea. It would be used when I'm introducing a new idea. For example, Jeff is a non-smoker and cannot bear the smell of cigarette smoke. In contrast, his best friend Pete, who is an avid smoker, loves the smell of cigarette smoke, or loves the smell of it doesn't bother him. So it's a contrast because I spoke about the experiences of two different people, Jeff and Pete, right? So in contrast would be a good connector when you're talking about two different ideas or two different subjects. But here, I'm not talking about two different subjects. I'm talking about the same subject, the same idea of scientific precision, and how sometimes foregoing scientific precision can lead to better outcomes in terms of drawing media attention. So in contrast is not correct here. Okay, in conclusion is definitely not correct because the second statement doesn't conclude the first statement. Okay, and what if I delete this? What if I delete it and I just write the two sentences as they are? That wouldn't make sense because it would confuse the reader, right? Because the second sentence is saying something opposite to what the first sentence is saying. So this one, I cannot delete the connector. I need a connector, and that connector is however. Okay, question 5. Legend has it that the corrupt politician William Boss Tweed once offered a bribe to Thomas Nast, a cartoonist famous for drawings that called for reforms to end corruption. As a result, Tweed's attempts to silence the artist failed, and Nast's cartoons played a key role in bringing Boss Tweed and his cronies to justice. Okay, so again, let's unpack. The first sentence is telling me that there was this corrupt politician, Boss Tweed, and it is said, it may not be true, but it is said that he once offered a bribe to a cartoonist, Thomas Nast, who had become famous for drawings that asked for reforms to end corruption. So clearly, because he was asking for ending corruption, he was a threat to Boss Tweed, who was corrupt, right? So Boss Tweed thought that if I pay a bribe to him, I could silence him and I could stop him from drawing these cartoons that could lead to my downfall. And the second line is saying that Tweed's attempt to silence the artist failed. So Tweed was not able to silence Thomas Nast. Thomas Nast did not accept the bribe. And the cartoons ultimately did play a role in bringing Tweed and his cronies, his associates, to justice. So I'm kind of giving a chronology, right? This passage is about a chronology of events. The first sentence talks about Boss Tweed possibly offering a bribe to Thomas Nast to stop drawing cartoons, and the second sentence saying that that attempt failed. So I can't say as a result, because as a result would make sense in case what happened in the second sentence was a result of the first one, but it's not, right? Because the attempt to bribe Nast failed. So it's not a result of the first one. So that doesn't make sense. For the same reason, therefore doesn't make sense, because therefore and as a result, if institute a cause-effect relationship, and this is not a cause-effect case, right? The second is telling me that Tweed was not able to bribe the artist. So this is also wrong. Okay, furthermore is when you want to introduce new information, right, related to a topic. For example, the green algae is able to produce glucose because of its green color, which has chlorophyll at the depth of an ocean. Furthermore, it is able to provide this food resource to tiny fish, right? So it's like I'm providing an additional piece of information to what has already been said. But this is not a furthermore question, because I'm describing what happened after those attempts to bribe Thomas Nast failed. Those attempts did not work out. They failed. So it's not an additional piece of information. So that doesn't make sense. And in fact, if you remove this and you just read it as Tweed offering a bribe to Thomas Nast and Tweed's attempt to silence the artist failed, that makes perfect sense chronologically, right? You don't need a connector because the attempt to bribe failed and Tweed went to jail. So in this case, the best answer is actually to delete this underlying portion and not use a connector. Question 1. Modern science took root and flourished in the soil of Christian theism, nourished by the Christian belief that the world was created by a conscious and intelligent God. Nevertheless, relations between science and Christian belief have often been strained, most particularly since the development of evolutionary biology. So in any connector question, it's very important to understand the relationship between the two sentences that you're trying to connect. So the first sentence here says that modern science, it took root, it originated and flourished in the soil of Christian theism, Christian belief, and it was nourished by the idea that the world was created by a conscious and intelligent God. So this sentence talks about a relationship between science and Christianity that's beneficial, that stems from science taking inspiration from Christian belief. The next sentence says relations between science and Christian belief have often been strained. So those relations that we were introduced to in the first sentence, those relations have been strained. They have not been the best, most particularly since the development of evolutionary biology. Because evolutionary biology, and especially Darwin's doctrines, say that man does not come from God. Man is not made in the image of God. Rather, man has come from ancestors, right? Which were animals, right? For example, chimps, monkeys, and so on. So that kind of led to a break between Christian doctrine and science. So I can see that the relationship between the two sentences is one of contrast, right? So nevertheless, which is a contrasting connector, actually makes sense here. So I like this. Consequently comes from consequence, which is to say the result of something. And the second sentence is not a result of the first one, right? So B is wrong. In this case is to kind of give an example of something. So again, that's not the relationship between the two sentences. So this is wrong. And in fact is used to stress something, right? For example, I wanted to attend your party. In fact, I had already purchased a gift for you, but I could not make it, right? So the sentence says, I had already purchased a gift for you, to kind of stress that, yes, I definitely wanted to come, right? So that impact is created with in fact. And that again is not the relationship I'm looking for here. So D is also wrong. So the best answer is option A, nevertheless. Question 2, the most useful chapter in the book discusses problem areas to address before starting an exercise regimen. Undoubtedly, it contains advice on improving sleep, hydration, breathing, and nutrition. Okay, so here I have two sentences that talk about a book, which is probably a book on diet or a book on exercise, because it talks about an exercise regimen. That's the most useful chapter in the book. And then I say it contains advice on improving sleep, hydration, breathing, and nutrition, right? So this line is kind of giving me more details, right, about this chapter of the book that was referred to in the first sentence, right? So it's the most useful chapter. It tells you what you need to do before you start an exercise program. And some of those things are improving sleep, hydration, etc. So this is more detail oriented. So undoubtedly doesn't really fit that context, because undoubtedly is used in the sense of being absolutely certain of something, right? For example, he's undoubtedly guilty of the crime, right? So that doesn't fit the context of the second line being more detail oriented than the first one. So I don't like A. Regardless is a contrasting connector, and these two sentences are not contrasting, so it's not B. Specifically is a good connector, right? I'm saying that this chapter is the most useful, and specifically, particularly, this part about the chapter is useful. The fact that it has advice on all of these things, right? So this is a good connector. And similarly is used when I'm trying to present a similarity or an analogy between two things. And that's not what I'm doing here. I'm talking about a particular piece of advice in the book that follows from the first statement. So D is not a good answer. The best answer is specifically. Question 3, there was a lot of reverse migration of workers and employees to villages and small towns during the COVID-induced lockdowns. Expectedly, there were no significant disruptions caused by such migration on the sales of consumer goods companies. Okay, so here my first sentence talks about the migration that happened when workers and employees returned to their villages and small towns from the big cities because of the COVID lockdowns. And my second sentence talks about no significant disruptions caused by such migrations on the sales of consumer goods companies, right? So I can see that the first sentence creates an expectation of all of these reverse migrations causing some sort of problem, some sort of trouble for consumer goods companies. But the second sentence says that there was no such problem. There were no significant disruptions. So the relationship between the two is one of contrast, right? The first one creates an expectation of disruption, and the second one says there was no disruption. So expectedly cannot be the right answer because expectedly is the opposite of what we are saying, right? It was not expected that there would be no disruptions, right? Disruptions were expected. So the fact that there were no disruptions cannot start with expectedly. So this is wrong. However is a good answer because however is a contrasting connector. There was a lot of migration. However, there were no significant disruptions. So I like B. Indeed is like, in fact, that it is used to stress something, right? So again, the second sentence is not stressing what is said in the first sentence. It is a contrasting sentence, so it's not C. And moreover is to kind of take the argument forward, to give additional information. And again, that's not happening. The best option would be the contrasting connector, which is option B. Question 4, a tornado ripped through the family's backyard, bringing down much of the house with it. Bricks crumbled into pieces, trees snapped in half, and the top floor collapsed. Fortunately, no one was home at the time. Okay, so here I'm describing a tornado which wreaked havoc through a family's house. The bricks crumbled, the trees snapped, and the top floor collapsed. But there was nobody at home, so nobody was hurt, right? So there was a lot of damage to the house, but nobody was hurt. So I like fortunately, right? Because fortunately kind of tells me that it was a good thing that nobody was home because otherwise there was a lot of damage. So I like option A. Effectively is used in the context of something being true, even when it may not be officially acknowledged, right? For example, effectively, he is the person who runs the company, right? Which is to say that he may not be the official CEO of the company, but it is he who has all the power, right? So that doesn't make sense in this context because here I'm talking about a tragedy and how there was a good part in that nobody was injured, so it can't be B. Okay, furthermore is similar to moreover in that it is used to present an additional piece of information. But then I want to kind of bring out the difference between the loss to property and the fact that no lives were lost. So it's not the best connector. And finally is used when you're talking about a series of things and you want to talk about the final step in that series, right? So it doesn't make sense here because here I'm just talking about the two things, the damage to the house versus the fact that nobody was home. So the best answer is option A. Question 5. The basis for this week's good news on the climate front was not the cutting-edge development of a new sustainable fuel source. Therefore, it was a simple tweak to the amount of lead that goes into petrol processing. This might seem a humble achievement, but it significantly advances our mission to protect the planet. Okay, so the first line talks about some good news on the climate front, and it says that it's not some cutting edge development of a new sustainable fuel source, right? Because we all know that one of the chief aims of the climate movement is to come up with a sustainable fuel so that our reliance on fossil fuels can be reduced. But that's not what we are talking about. It is a simple tweak to the amount of lead that goes into petrol processing. So the good news comes from this simple change in the amount of lead that is used in petrol. And even though that seems to be a humble achievement, it is something that will significantly take forward our mission to protect the planet. So even as I'm reading it, I can see that there would be a contrasting connector that's required here because I'm saying the basis is not the cutting edge development of a new sustainable fuel source, but a simple tweak to the amount of lead. So that but is kind of inbuilt when I try to join the two sentences. So it can't be therefore because therefore is a cause effect connector. I use therefore when I'm talking about the result of something. So it's not that. Rather is a good answer, right? Rather is a contrasting connector. So I'm saying that the basis is not this, rather it is a simple tweak. So I like that. To that end is used when you're trying to talk about reaching a goal, right? So the players wanted to make sure that they qualify for the Olympics. To that end, they trained heavily at the gym every week.
So to achieve that goal, they trained heavily at the gym, right? So again, that doesn't fit the context of what we are saying. And generally is used in the sense of like generally speaking, or in a sense of talking about the general state of things. And that's not a good connector here, because here I need something that expresses the contrast between the sentences. So it's option B.